Welcome to BioIT World's Trends from the Trenches podcast, your insider's look at the science, technology, and executive trends driving the life sciences. I'm Allison Proffitt, editor of BioIT World. This episode is hosted by Stan Gloss, founder of BioTeam, a life sciences IT consulting company at the intersection of science, data, and technology. Joining Stan today is Heidi Rehm of Massachusetts General Hospital and the Broad Institute, and most recently, the new president-elect of GA4GH, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. Together, Heidi and Stan discuss how data sharing policies and standards can advance both genomics and health. Let's listen in.
Good morning, Heidi. It's been such a long time since we've had a chat together. I think it was a number of years ago where our topic was all about laboratory information systems. So a lot has changed since we have last spoken. And today we're actually talking about GA4GH and your role. And so maybe for our listeners, maybe you could kind of introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and then maybe a little bit about GA4GH.
Sure. So my background is both in genomics research, particularly on the clinical side, rare disease research, but I'm also a clinical lab director and have directed clinical labs for many years. So I span both the clinical side and the research side, working on discovering the causes of rare disease and then working with clinicians to implement strategies for allowed diagnosis of patients. So I've been sort of in this world for many years, and I'm very excited to take on this new role as chair for the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. Starting January, I'll step into you and Bernie's position, will become the chair emeritus, and I'm right now the chair-elect. So looking forward to that transition and many new things that we can do within the Global Alliance.
Wow, those are big shoes to step into. We've known Ewan for many years. He's a good friend of BioTeam, and he and Chris Degdegian did a lot of work on standards related to biomedical information. So maybe you can give us a little understanding of the mission and what is the foundation all about?
The Global Alliance is really formed to enable data sharing to advance genomics and health, both research and medicine. And so really we're focused on the building of standards and policies that can enable global data sharing so that we can advance genomic medicine, genomic research. And that's our core mission in terms of how we function.
So what standards are you seeing, widely adopted these days?
Yeah, so we've really worked in a lot of different areas. We have a number of work streams, and that's how we divide up the sort of areas of work. So we have work streams working on large-scale genomics and cloud interoperability. We have our foundational work streams are in regulatory and ethics and data security, because that touches on everything we do. We have work streams in discovery and genomic knowledge standards and phenotype, clinical phenotype. So there's lots of different areas that we've been working to develop standards that touch on all of those things and help address, can I share this data? And how can I share this data? And can I make sure I share it in a secure way? As well as what is the format of that data so that it is interoperable with other data that's out there. Because if I want to scale my analyses and be able to combine two large data sets together, if the standards being used to define the data elements in each of those data sets is different and formatted different, it becomes very difficult for me to do a analysis of both data sets together. And so we're really trying to work on creating an ecosystem that enables global data sharing, which requires things to be put into standards to enable that to happen.
Yeah. So in your response, I heard something that I would want to kind of probe a little bit about on. We hear a lot about standards being developed for all kinds of things, but then all of a sudden you started talking about the use and the implementation of those standards as being something that seems very important, because realistically, you can publish standards, but understanding how people use that data and how they're using the standards. So can we maybe get your thoughts about that?
Right. So, some of this comes down to how data is consented. If you run a research program and your consent says we will never share this data with anyone else, it'll only be used for our study. Well, that prohibits the ability to allow others to use it. So in our regulatory and ethics work stream, a lot of work has gone into the development of consent templates that others can then use in their own research that then allows that downstream sharing to be able to happen. So, so that's really a policy framework that is required to enable use of data, as opposed to an actual standard for how the data gets shared. Because, if you can't share it, then no standard is going to help you there, right?
Right. So when we think about implementation of anything, there's always the desire on one side of an equation to want to do it. And then on the other side, underneath running out, is the friction that it takes to actually overcome the inertia of making that change. So how does an organization like you're working in GA4GH, think about reducing friction of people's usage and adoption of a standard?
Yes. So, one way that we make this easier for, the global community is by convening our community together to learn from each other. So it's not just, can we develop standards and stick them out there and assume that everyone's just going to figure out how to use them? We really have to convene people together and have them actively work together on implementing those standards and revising them when they're not working. So, you can imagine that one group is prevented from sharing data because of certain assumptions that their country or their organization is making. But if they come together with others who have shown how to get around those challenges, they can learn from each other and they can go back to their organization and their company or their country and say, gee, this country was able to do X and, got permission to do that, was sharing data, nothing bad has happened. Here's how they implemented it. Can we do the same? And I think that leading by example, both, allows decisions that can be changed when barriers are present. It can also show how to actually implement something in a practical way. These so-called reference implementations can be developed by our work streams. And sometimes those reference implementations that give an example to others are based on groups actually being the first ones to implement something and then demonstrating to others how they've done it. And so that learning and cross-fertilization of approaches is really critical to allowing everybody to advance together as opposed to living in silos. And if one person puts their data out, but no one else does, that doesn't really accomplish the mission.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing, a lot of times standards get imposed on people in this hierarchical, that comes down from the mountain, so to speak, and thou shalt implement a standard. What I hear in the work that you're doing is actually you use the word ecosystem to really build it. And what I hear you describing is something near and dear to my heart, which is building learning organizations. I just actually finished reading The Fifth Discipline from Peter Senge, and really how to build learning organizations and this iterative process where we have to continue really thinking about this not as a linear approach, but really circular development, where we're testing and learning and going out to the marketplace. One of the questions I had about was going back to COVID, and my perception of the marketplace is that during COVID, a lot of things that we said we couldn't do in terms of sharing actually came down and broke through barriers because we had to.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
so did that COVID affect, how did that affect GA4GH? And did that change anything as a result of COVID and now open up opportunities that weren't there before?
I definitely think it was as tragic as aspects of the COVID pandemic have been. It has been a great example of the ability to come together, share data rapidly and productively to accomplish a mission. And Global Alliance was engaged in some of the viral genome sequencing data sharing and creating standards and frameworks and communities to be able to enable that to happen. So Global Alliance was part of that effort in terms of helping with those approaches. But at the end of the day, the organizations that were generating this data really came together to make it happen. And it was, we are enablers, but we don't actually do the final work. That is all of the, members of our community that are actually making things happen. But I do think it paved the way for why it's so important to share data. It's a wonderful use case, and that happened both on sharing of viral sequencing data, but also human sequencing data to understand why some people, get long-term COVID or are more severely ill and worse outcomes compared to others, and understanding what are the host factors that lead to that was really, was learned because of so much data sharing across the globe in both host and viral sequence data.
Do you have any other examples of implementations that you can share with us?
Sure. So, one project that was an early, what we originally called demonstration projects at the Global Alliance, we had several of these early on. One that was incredibly successful is the Matchmaker Exchange. And this was a federated network of rare disease databases that shared gene candidates for rare disease. So what often happens in rare disease is you'll have an individual with a rare disease, you'll sequence their genome, and you'll identify a variant in a particular gene, but not have enough evidence to actually publish that gene as having a causal role in disease, because you need more patients, more examples of variants in that same gene. So by developing an API that became is a standard of Global Alliance that allowed us to define the fields that we would exchange across these databases, we were able to connect all of these rare disease databases, allow researchers to be connected when they had the same gene candidate flagged in a case. Mm-hmm. And then through that API-based connection, which would actually then lead to an email, jointly CCing all of both groups that were part of the same, candidate variant in a particular gene, brought together to then share additional details, decide if that was a valid match, and then publish the paper. And that has led to thousands of novel gene discoveries because of researchers all using this federated platform that connects thousands of researchers around the world. So that's just, one of many examples of where, the work of the Global Alliance is really helping develop these, productive data sharing environments that's advancing both research and medicine.
So one of the overhyped and probably talked about terms in our marketplace is artificial intelligence. And how does the Global Alliance think about data readiness for actually doing AI and machine learning analysis? Because 80% of the work is just getting the data ready for the analysis. Yeah. So how does the Alliance think about AI readiness?
Yeah, it's obviously a rapidly emerging area that is of interest to both our organization and the many groups that are part of the Global Alliance. That said, I wouldn't necessarily say that making data AI ready is that different than making it ready for lots of different applications. AI is just, a strategy and a way to look at data and learn from it through ways that we can't even design to allow that data to essentially tell us a story that we may not know. But at the same time, structuring it in ways that allow it to be consistently represented is critical for the work we've always done, as well as using it for AI type applications. So I don't think it's the use of AI today and its rapid evolution. I don't think is fundamentally changing how we think about the data and the interoperability that we need to support the standards for data exchange. At the same time, it's creating lots of good use cases for the need for this data to be interoperable and ready for whatever application comes its way, right?
Oh, that's fantastic. So what is the most active area of development that we will be seeing from the Global Alliance in the near future?
Sure. I think what we're seeing right now is many large data sets being generated around the world. And if you look at the IHCC, the international, lost track of what IHCC stands for, but it's basically an organization that's defining all of the cohorts across the globe that are generating large sets of data that are willing to share that data. And as we generate more of these data sets, all of a sudden the need to figure out how to access them and combine them becomes, a challenge and a need. For example, the UK Biobank data set has been enormously instrumental in lots of genomic discoveries and advancing science in that area. And the broad data sharing that the UK Biobank has done has been quite enabling. But now, there's the All of Us research program in the US that's releasing large-scale data sets. And finally now allowing international use, which has been a goal of the All of Us research program for quite some time, but just realizing that finally now, as we've been dealing with security and other parameters. So now these are two large data sets, and people are naturally going to want to, use both data sets together. But that's a challenge. How can we enable that? And then there will continue to be more and more of these data sets generated, being put out for broad international use. So how can we combine these data sets and allow use? So I think that's just one key example of ensuring that data is accessible and the data is formatted in ways that can allow these cross-consortium or cross-cohort analyses. So I think like the researcher identity. So how can I get access to the UK Biobank? How can I get access to the All of Us research program? What is the authentication process to define me as a researcher? And within countries, we have our own systems, like in the US, the use of dbGaP and ERA Commons and that system, but that is not present around the world. So how do we authenticate a researcher who's coming from a non-US site to be able to use US data? Right. That is where the Global Alliance is really critical in the development of our passports and visas sort of systems that are being implemented in a number of places will allow the access. But then to do the actual analyses, we need to be able to send analytical approaches to a data set, retrieve back the results and combine them and aggregate with other results. So the standards to send out, do those analyses and bring back those standards, as well as the format of all the data, so that what we're bringing back makes sense and is comparable. So those are some of the areas that we are really working on. We also have an implementation project that we're calling the variant level matching project. It's really building off the Matchmaker Exchange, but instead of sharing gene candidates, we're being able to query large data sets to say, do you have this variant in any individual in your data set? And if so, please return the phenotype of that individual to me. This is critical in rare disease analyses where we're looking for incredibly rare variants that might have just a handful of individuals around the world with important information to learn from just those few individuals. So how can we connect databases to return both the existence of a genotype, but the associated metadata like phenotype with that data?
It's funny when you talk about passports and visas and all of that. It reminds me of a conversation I had, a couple conversations actually, with Bryn Roberts from Roche. And Bryn and I will actually be at BioIT World Europe doing a fireside chat. But the concept that we talked about a number of times was the idea of being a data citizenship and actually being a good. So it sounds like you were talking about the development of standards for being a good global data citizen. And this is part of your mission. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, it's certainly, our framework within Global Alliance is based on fundamental principles of data sharing, and that all individuals have the right to share their data, and should be able to do that and participate in that. But you're right, it is citizenship and adhering to those standards is critical to all of the work that we do and to the science that we hope to achieve.
So you talked about connections to things like All of Us and UK Biobank. Do you have any example? I'm from the commercial space as a commercial provider, and we do work with All of Us and NIH and all of these other organizations. But do you have any examples where the Global Alliance has worked to facilitate a kind of public-private collaboration? How do commercial or public companies get involved, and are they involved?
Absolutely. Commercial entities are part of the Global Alliance ecosystem, and have been from the very start. We recognize that the implementation of standards is often going to happen in the commercial sector, and the commercial sector will build platforms and applications that allow a lot of the work that we want to do to happen. And so we've had partnerships, or members of commercial entities part of our activities from the very start. David Glazer, who's with Google, has been a key member of our leadership, at the Global Alliance, and a key member of many of the work streams. That's just one example. We have many others. DNA Stack, Microsoft. There's many entities. Illumina. I could list hundreds that are part of the work we do, and they can span work stream leaders, part of our steering committee, members developing standards, but also implementers. And the principles that we really build on is the idea that the standards themselves are open, without restriction, and are not commercialized or patented or other things, or at least not patented for commercial sale. However, the implementations can be private, and be a commercial product. So we really try to balance that, recognizing the really key and important role that the commercial sector plays. And that also includes generating and sharing data. And we, are working with many. So in my world, I work closely with lots of clinical labs, most of which are commercial clinical labs that are critical players in data sharing in the ClinVar database around genomic knowledge. So that's just one example of a very tight relationship between both the academic and commercial communities in terms of data sharing that's been incredibly productive to the classification of variants and the interpretation of rare disease patients.
So my final question for you, Heidi, is the Global Alliance has done such an amazing work over the past 10 years. I guess everybody would love to know where are you going in the next 10 years, and what's the bigger vision of where the Global Alliance wants to go next and continue to branch?
Sure. So I don't think there's any real fundamental changes that we are making and will make in the next 10 years, but we are definitely having more of an emphasis on implementation. In our early phase, we really just had to figure out how to work together, how to convene, what were our needs, and begin sort of developing the infrastructure and the funding. These types of organizations that are cross consortia, cross country, cross everything, don't survive if you don't have dedicated funding and a committed staff that can carve out their time. So we have many full-time employees that are really the critical underpinnings of the Global Alliance. So building that workforce to be able to enable all of the work and not be entirely reliant on volunteerism. We are reliant on volunteerism. There are lots of people that volunteer their time, but they shouldn't have to organize the meetings and do all of everything, right? So that was a key component. And then really building the standards themselves that were critical to begin enabling our work and the work streams to build those standards. So that's been a huge focus. In the next 10 years, a lot more focus will be on the implementation of those standards. We'll continue to build more standards, more are needed. There's still lots of work in that space to be done, but we'll really start, convening to define the implementations, figure out where our gaps are, and execute on the work that we are doing to actually solve real world problems in genomics and health research and medicine. So I think that implementation stage is a bigger emphasis in this next phase. Also, we are recognizing the need to engage more deliberately with our clinical communities. And that includes clinical laboratories, healthcare systems, the software systems that support healthcare, like our electronic health record, providers. All of those individuals are critical, both because there's a lot of data being generated in the clinical community, and that needs to be part of the research ecosystem. And then we also want to better translate the results of research into the clinical arena. And that bidirectional, tight-knit engagement is critical to the work that we do in genomics and health. And we have to better support that clinical side of things. And it's not to say the direct clinical standards of healthcare, but really the standards that enable us to cross those boundaries and support a learning, healthcare system and the research that's needed to underpin that, but also the consumption of data to flow into research to learn from it. So that will be another area of increased focus I see over the next 10 years is really supporting that, as well as helping everyone out there realize the benefit of data sharing and engage in those activities to make it just an incredibly robust system that we can all benefit from.
Yeah, so we are actively implementing with our clients some of the GA4GH standards. Where and how would companies like ours at BioTeam, work with you and share the stories? Because I think people learn from stories, and the more implementation stories we can tell and use cases, the better. So I'm just asking you this question so other companies like ours can figure out how to connect with the global alliance.
So I think there's a couple different ways to engage. So one, we have an open outward-facing plenary meeting every year, and we just had one in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago. And that's, we hope anyone out there will come and will engage. And we actually have presentations from active implementers of our standards, and that includes commercial entities showing, and we had commercial players presenting at our meeting their implementations so that we can learn from them. In addition, individuals can join specific work streams as members of those work streams so that they can be part of the development. Perhaps you look at the standards we have and say, well, these work, but those don't work, or there's a missing standard here that's needed. And you're willing to be part of the development and defining what that standard is, perhaps even part of the development of the standard, as well as perhaps the implementation of that standard. And so reaching out and saying, I'd like to get involved in this particular work stream. They're all listed on our website. We have ways to reach out and contact us and immediately get involved in participating in the regular work stream meetings. We also, when a new standard is being proposed, we form what's called a study group to really investigate the need for that standard, who's going to use it, and ensure that we don't spend our time developing something that only gets implemented by one group. That wouldn't be worth the lots of time it takes to develop a standard. So, being part of that study group to help define the need for a standard is also ways our community gets involved. So there's lots of different ways. And then we have a spring meeting, which is our Global Alliance Connect meeting. That's a slightly more internally facing meeting where our work streams come together, do their work, but also have cross work stream meetings to ensure that our standards are interoperable across our own work streams and across the work we're doing. And often the implementations require standards from multiple different work streams to be stitched together in terms of an implementation. So it allows us to really sort of engage in that way deliberately. So I encourage you, if you have both ways you want to engage or examples of the use of our standards, reach out, and we'd love to hear that. And there will likely be things that we want to highlight.
Well, Heidi, thank you so much. It was a great conversation, and I've learned a lot today from you about the work that the Global Alliance is doing, and encourage many others to join in to the fun and excitement and work that the Alliance is doing. Thank you so much, Heidi.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to BioIT World's Trends from the Trenches podcast.